this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Joining me today on The Conversation is Eric Stone. Eric is a seasoned leadership expert and award-winning author, keynote speaker with over 30 years of experience in corporate and nonprofit organizations. He spent nearly 3 decades in enterprise holdings where he became one of the most decorated regional vice presidents in the company's history. After what he thought was retirement, Eric discovered his true passion, helping organizations build high-performance cultures. Today, as the founder and CEO of ClearPath Ventures, he works with leaders that drive employee engagement, prevent burnout, and create exceptional customer experiences. His insights are captured in his award-winning book, Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture, and through his international keynote talks and workshops. Eric, thanks so much for joining me today.
Clint, thanks for having me as a guest. I can't wait to get started.
Yeah, this book was amazing. I have to tell you, I read it cover to cover and really enjoyed all of it. And there's so many things we could talk about. I actually loved how you made the analogy because of your career in cars about we're going on a journey together in a car and you have all your road maps and your pit stops. And it's really, really, really well done. So I appreciate that. You know, I like to think of all the guests who come on my show as superheroes. And of course, all superheroes have a backstory or an origin story. So what's yours? How did you get where you are today?
You know, I'll give a few things. I think, first of all, I was the smallest kid in my high school class as I was growing up. So I had to learn, when you're a small guy, to be quick-witted, quick on your feet, and that helped me transition into my love of business. And my dad was a businessman. He was a textile salesman. Mom was a teacher. And for some reason, I was hooked pretty early on the business. I used to eavesdrop and hear these conversations when my dad would come home from a business trip. And I just continued to love it. And geez, back at 1980, the U.S. Olympic hockey team wins the gold. And I was always fascinated with how are these college people getting together to inevitably shock the world in the Miracle on Ice. And so I took my love of the game of business, went to school at Roger Williams with a business degree, and really landed on enterprise rent-a-car and started one of four in a location, and learning all the things of what to do and or what not to do that I would someday use as my own little toolkit. And I was able to, like many, kind of work my way up the corporate ladder, and eventually was an officer of the company. And we were fortunate, as you mentioned kindly in the introduction, that we were considered one of the most decorated regions within the country, which in a competitive, talented realm of that, it was quite rewarding. And then I felt I had more to give. And so at the peak of our game, I made a unique decision, and I retired from enterprise. And I felt, instead of maybe impacting a few hundred employees, hey, maybe I can take some of this stuff that I've acquired through others and myself and share it. And hence a book, an outline comes, and then the outline comes into more stories. And then I'm using my network and interviews to make it better and better. And next thing you know, a book is complete. The book becomes speaking opportunities because it is such a top-of-mind topic and so critical and so misunderstood that it's been, as you mentioned in the beginning, it's just a passion of mine, this leadership that goes on in organizations.
Well, speaking of the book, let's throw it up here so people can see it. Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture. So go out and get 3 copies because I'm sure you know 2 people who need one.
That's right.
So let's start with what I consider a pretty basic question, but I think semantics matter. How do you define culture?
I think the shortest definition I would give is behaviors in action, and or when there are no gaps with your values and your behaviors. And then if you take it a little bit further, when you think of organizations, whether it's Starbucks and you get a cup of coffee, it's Dick's Sporting Goods, it's whoever it may be, it is the behaviors that exist when the leadership is not in the room. And that is really what it's all about. It's very similar to personal branding. Personal brand, my personal brand, would be what people say when I'm not in the room. And culture is a little bit of the behaviors that are done when the person's not in the room. I think that's the most basic practical definition for me.
That's kind of how I've always thought about it as well, is people can have their values on the wall and whatever, but culture is really, it isn't what I say. It's what happens when the cameras are off and when the phone, if you're in the office and you see me talk to the client and then I hang up and I say some disparaging comment or roll my eyes, that's kind of culture. Which brings me to another, I was going to ask this later, but I'll go ahead and throw it in now because it seems right. In today's world of hybrid and remote work, one of the challenges that I've always felt existed was if I'm a new employee and I don't go into the office, how do I learn about a culture when all I see is what's on the Zoom call? And as you just said, culture is kind of what happens after the Zoom call is over. So what is the challenge there?
Yeah, unique times, right? It's what many consider the flexibility debate. What's the best way to be productive, innovative, collaborative? Is it remote, in-person, hybrid? And I have 11 nieces and nephews, Clint, and they're all in the workforce. And then I have my 3 kids, and they're in the workplace. And then I have all their friends, and they're in the workplace. And so I have a front row seat of how things have shifted. And my biggest guidance, for example, my daughter just gets a new job. It is fully remote. And she is going to reach out and drive to Cranston, Rhode Island to meet her boss because she wants to really start to understand what her boss is all about, what she feels the company's all about. So she's actually going to meet in person to learn a little bit. And so that's one thing, is just understanding that in person is going to be tough to beat. And so you have to find ways to do that. There are so many other opportunities that, like me and you, Clint, it's not like we had this long history. We've learned pretty quickly about each other on a call that's a Zoom, where expectations can be clear and we can communicate those with each other and we can develop a relationship. It might look a little different. We can still personally and professionally help each other develop. We can ensure that we're rewarding top performance. We can do a lot of these things. And so you have to, in my opinion, it's just harder. It is. I mean, you don't go to any weddings virtual. You want to be there because it's a different experience. And so I don't know if anyone's bottled the special formula, but you have to be pretty creative. Hopefully the leadership it has these rotating things where they're available and accessible. And I think that's one big thing, is on a Friday between the hours of 12 and 1, they might have this open lunch hour. I don't know. But you got to find ways where people cannot get too siloed, have a real vision of only 1 or 2 people. And that's where sought out mentors and things like that are important, that you expect people to go reaching out, even if it's over virtual.
That brings up another point. I was going to reach this later, but later in the book, you talk about the power of your mentor. I think his name was John, and how he helped you a lot. And I'm wondering if you could expand on what that mentor meant to you, how he helped you, and then again, kind of back into the previous question, how do I find a good mentor when I'm remote?
Yeah. So it was interesting. As I started my career, I actually didn't have an amazing experience in the beginning. I felt I wasn't getting trained the way I wanted to. I really was. I was quite overwhelmed. I had no idea. And in that time, it were just like binders they'd tell you to read. And I was quite overwhelmed until I met John. And John showed what went behind the decisions. It wasn't just go do this and do that. He explained kind of that why and why we were doing all those things. And he would take the time during the workday to show me the financials. So all your hard work, and the reason it's so important to sell or make good business decisions is because eventually it's going to hit our financial statements. And here's what that looks like. And so he took the time out of a typical busy day to truly show me why and how we could do these things. And so it was really, really important. And the funny story is we used to share all the time that, hey, maybe someday we'll run a region together. Fast forward several years later, we compete for the exact same regional manager spot, but instead of 1, they create 2. We both had a chance to become regional managers together and help lead a struggling region at the time into a much, much better place. The sought out, I use my daughter or kids or nieces and nephews, or when I coach people, is you do have to kind of search for those who you aspire to be like. Sometimes corporations have their little bio sheets of all their leadership or senior leadership. If they don't, you should encourage an opportunity to find ways to go on these scavenger hunts and meet different people. And so I don't think you want to force it. I do think you want to come natural, but you want to get out of the gates early and try to meet as many people as you can. It's pretty uncomfortable. You can do that virtually with a simple invite that I'd love to know a little bit more, Clint, about what you do. I'm a new hire and I'm really interested in accounting and wherever, and I'd love a 15-minute coffee talk, a chat. Those are things that you have to attempt to do. And certainly encourage when you can get out of this remote world, because a lot of companies are trying to at least get people together quarterly. That's where you got to show up.
Yeah, I think you did a good job of that throughout the book. As I was reading it, you talked about all the road trips you would make. Again, keeping the car theme, but
Yeah.
you'd go the night before, meet with the leadership team, and then the day of, you'd have different meetings, and maybe you'd have one-offs after that. And so I think you did a wonderful job of describing how that could work. So I think what I'm hearing is you have to be intentional in that I've got to figure out who could or should be my mentor, and then also have to figure out what do I need to do to understand the company culture, what it really is, and then try to be intentional about maybe getting together at least sometimes. Zoom can't be everything.
Absolutely. It's no different, Clint, than when I was writing the book. Listen, I didn't have all the answers. I had my experience. I did interviews. I didn't know these people. I had to find ways to open my networks, to use my networks to get me to other people. I have a really cool story. It's not locked yet, but I'm a huge sports fan and business fan, and I had to get out of my comfort zone. I'm close to locking down an interview with Gino Auriemma, who's a 12-time champion, and I don't know Gino. Gino did something for me years ago. He doesn't know me from Adam, but I use certain connections, and that's what I think is really important. I did it with the book. I'd encourage people to do it in the workplace, and that's how I've met some amazing people and learned so much along the way.
No, I think that's important. You have to leverage your connections. I know some people who talk about it's almost like monetizing, which I hate that. I mean, you shouldn't. To me, it's not monetizing your connections. Just you try to look for win-win situations where they get something out of it as well as you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm usually trying to give more all the time to that individual, especially if they're taking their time out of their busy day. I've got to, and then if someone ever reaches out to me, I got to deliver. I've got to take this as an honor that someone reaches out to me, and I want to make their lives a little easier, and I want to connect them to somebody. So yeah, whether you're the mentee, the mentor, there's a responsibility for both parties. It's not just the mentor. The mentee's got to come. Really, the mentor is only a guider. They don't solve the problem,
Right. I like how you said in the book that building culture is a journey, and the journey is a destination. And that's kind of how life is. So can you expand on that a little bit, what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I could take it to one of my last stops, and geez, listen, there were some talented people, but there was also a lot of opportunities that weren't there. And if you're trying to move an organization with hundreds of employees, as much as we'd like to think we're going to make a decision and everyone's going to be on board, it's just not how it works. You're really turning a proverbial battleship at times. And so you have to take an initiative, and then you've got to take that initiative and tuck it into the training of the organization. They have to have the right material, equipment, and information in order to achieve this desired outcome. And so we would take that. You then have to train everybody, and it's got to be repetitive, kind of a lather, rinse, repeat at times. It's got to be omnipresent. It's got to be in reviews. Your initiative's in training, and it gets reviewed in an employee review, a performance review, or however you do it. And so that takes time. As much as we'd love to say, wave the magic wand, presto, we're good, it took me probably 6 months to really start making some traction in a large organization, that we were starting to celebrate some small victories. And I think that's the key, is we were able to secure a couple of simple wins, and those simple wins, we doubled down on them. And so the analogy of a journey, it just takes a while, and it just never ends. And behind me is really like a symbol. It's an hourglass. For those of you who see the video here, and it's the term hour. Like hour. Together we're going to do this. Not an eyeglass that me and you are both wearing. It's the hourglass. And it's a process, because it's a journey. And in the beginning, on the top of an hourglass, as you visualize it, if it's just an audio for some, is just as the gathering, that listen, observe, and learn, seeds of trust being built. What are we going to pull from everybody that's important? Stakeholders, board members, whoever it is, customers, clients, vendors. And you're going to kind of take all that, and as the hour bows out, you're orchestrating some of the commitments, the plans, and things like that until it goes right where the sand is. That is the magic. That is where you amplify your message. The rollout then begins and it goes outward as an hourglass bows out. Training, reviews, reinforcement time. The sand eventually lands on the bottom, and that's where you assess it through whatever assessment tools you may use or have. And on each side of that hourglass are your guiding lights. Those are policies and procedures, mission, vision, values. Those are going to help you guide your decision making. And as you can see, it is a journey. It takes a little bit of time. And right when you think you have it, Clint, as you know better than anybody, new technology comes out, a pandemic, who knows, you turn the hourglass over and really reassess where you are in that process. So it takes, I'd give the analogy, how do you get rich? Slowly. How do you build culture? Slowly. How do you get in shape? Slowly,
No, that's great. I was just thinking about what I'd also read. You said that when you do think you got to the end, now it's time to reassess and what can you do better and move forward again. So that's, I guess, turning the hourglass back over.
That's right. And that's such a key piece, because once your team gets very fundamentally sound and you've empowered them to execute those commitments, or we used to call them big rock items, those 3 to 5 key things, they could get bored, and you got to be really careful in business. You don't want people bored. And so we would use certain, we call them think tanks, where we get a group of managers together who would really be looking down the road for things that might be coming up. And we called it the behind the back pass. That's when we knew we were executing at a high level. We wanted to bring in something a little bit different. And it creates that newness. And as we said, we take that newness, bring it into the training, relevant in the reviews, everything in alignment, makes things stick, traction happens.
Well, this is one of the terms I hadn't written down to ask you about, but you just mentioned it. The power of listening to, observing, and learning about your people is the foundation of a strong culture. And to me, it's the old, I don't know if it's everywhere. I think of it as a Southern term, but maybe it's everywhere. But it's, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth and use them in that ratio when you're talking about listening to and observing and learning, as opposed to just talking all the time.
Yeah, there's a couple of good quotes. One is, you may think you're the smartest person in the room, but you're never smarter than the room. And I think that's really important to understand, is as you move up in your career and climb that ladder, you got to be careful that you don't become relatable and you're just assuming things are going to happen. And it's really important. I know the Starbucks CEO recently, there was a change. The old CEO would spend time rotating to listen, observe, and learn with his baristas half day a month, and get some insights that he wanted to be, get prepared for. What's possible? What's not possible? All those things. Some HR folks will call that a stay interview, but really, really important. Now, just because it's said doesn't mean it's real. So I used to have some folks who would say, Eric, we need 5 more people. And I would ask them a simple, tell me about your thought process that goes behind you feeling you need more people. And let's look at some of this stuff. You may be right, but I want to understand how you're truly running your operation today as it exists. And next thing you know, you find 3 or 4 opportunities, and they might not need an employee. Maybe sometimes they will, but.
Well, you said don't let yourself be too relatable, and I'm immediately thinking of the story where you went into the room dressed as a boxer because you had a cut above your head from a basketball game you'd had a week before with some 6'5" guy elbowed you.
That's right. So true story. I was trying to show my athletic skills. For whatever reason, I guess the higher I climbed, they thought I was less athletic, I guess. And I was a decent athlete. And so we were on the court, and I got a huge gash across my forehead. Next day is this big retreat that we have. And I'll never forget that the joke was to come in as Rocky and dance around the room. And again, you gotta look like a turkey every once in a while. And I'm sure I did. But it was a lot of fun.
You could take that 2 ways. You can either say, I tripped and fell, or took it as, I had a sports injury. So you went with a good one.
That's right. That's right. True story. It was sports.
All right. So your book also talks about accountability as a critical part of the workplace culture. How can we as leaders create a culture of accountability without it feeling punitive?
Yeah. That's where I'll go, and I've lightly touched a few other things that have to happen first. So you must truly create strong relationships from the hiring process to the onboarding. Step one, what does your relationship building look like? We talked about the right information in order to achieve the desired outcome through the employee journey. Again, tuck a few things under there. Clearly communicating your goals and expectations so people aren't confused. I think it's only less than 60% of the people are aware of what's expected. Developing them personally and professionally. And then the ability to, you always want to recognize effort and reward excellence is a term I used to always say. When you do those things, when you are truly contributing those 5 key, really employee engagement pieces, it is allowing you to hold people accountable. You have given them a good roadmap. You have empowered them to do the same. And it's critical, believe it or not. We used to do employee opinion surveys, and I would get astounded by people who said, we don't deal well with non-performers. And it was so eye-opening to say, wow, they're asking to be held accountable. You just can't hammer people, and if you remember in the book, there's the velvet hammer. You do have to
ask
have
about that. Yeah,
an approach where it's human-centric. It's actually behind me. High character, high standard is kind of what's back there. And people do want to be held accountable. Hence, that's why there are coaches in the gym. They push a little bit more. Now, if you just are all over somebody, it tends to not be as genuine, not as authentic. Authenticity matters. And so you make your job harder when you aren't supplying some of those other things. The more I coached, the more I was able to challenge. I felt very comfortable with it. A lot of people have a difficult time with those conversations.
Yeah, I think it's funny because human nature is what it is. And I don't think I'm unique. I find that if I have landscaping being done, I'll complain about the one that's not blooming as opposed to thanking the landscaper. Look at all these beautiful flowers. I'm like, how come? What happened to that one? Why is it dying? Or if I'm investing in, I have a buddy I invest with out in California in some real estate deals, and he'll send out the performer. I'm like, yeah, that's all great, but what about this one that's been a dog for 3 months? What about that one? It's like, yeah. Well, so it's hard not to be putative at times, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think the key is instead of instilling fear, you're instilling a sense of urgency. And I think we owe it to the customer and our employee to have an amazing experience in whatever you do. And so it's not okay. I used to use the analogy, if I go to McDonald's and I get a hamburger, it's supposed to be hot. Like, I don't get bonus points if it's hot. It's supposed to be hot. And so in the rental industry, the car's supposed to be clean. We're supposed to be ready. You don't get bonus points for some of those things. And so, it is something that I think a lot of people struggle with is, this quote unquote theory that you have to complement, 5 recognitions to 1 held accountable type. And I don't know what the magic number is. I just know I was always coaching. And when I saw greatness, I wanted to recognize it. And when I saw opportunity, I wanted to recognize that too.
I didn't think about adding this to the question, but it just came up organically here. When you're talking about, you expect the car to be clean. There's a Seinfeld episode about taking the reservation and keeping the reservation, and the expectations is to keep the reservation and have the car available.
You can take the reservation, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's a great one.
So you mentioned, I was going to ask you later, how did you acquire the nickname, the Velvet Hammer?
So I think over the years, so I wasn't a big yeller, and when it was time to raise my tone, they'd hear it. And so I think people respected the fact that that's how I would handle business. Listen, a lot of people drop F-bombs all over the meetings, and I would be very calculated with word choice. And when I said it, it mattered. But I think it was balancing this humane ability to say, Clint, I really appreciate all that hard work and effort, but we also have to execute all the time. And what we're missing here is, and so tell me about what you think you're seeing. And I just think the ability to pull versus too much of a push. And so I think I was able to acquire maybe a talent of pulling versus feeling I had to push, but not lower the standard. And I think that was so important. My son, believe it or not, works in the old region I used to run. And he was at a recent event, and his old area manager, who I actually hired, was making a comment about that. No matter what, it was this high standard that we were not going to compromise, even with challenges that were real. And so after that, legend grows and people get fun with it. And then next thing you know, the velvet hammer comes out.
I got you. Now, there were some stats that I found, I guess, at first maybe a bit eye-opening, and then upon further consideration, they were probably not that surprising. But you talked about, I think it was OC Tanner 2020 Global Culture Report, and I'll just throw out some that were, I think, eye-opening. 51% of employees think their organization is great at, only 51% think their organization is great at listening to them. Only 56% feel their leaders stay in touch with what they need. And this is the big one. And only 1/5 of ideas are ever heard because employees are afraid to speak up. So you say that, these facts, along with your personal experiences, led you to develop the listen, observe, and learn process. So expand on it a little bit. How did you find that the listening, observing, and learning helped you combat those stats?
So what we ended up doing is, for whatever reason, I made a decision to meet with, at that time, it was about 150 people, which is a lot of people to have to meet with. And, in certain increments. And I think the point is I learned so much from that. It became an initiative. Remember I talked about in the beginning is what's the initiative that'll be in the training? And so that experience was brought in my think tank, those group of managers who would meet with me every other month and look for creative ways. We labeled it as what we called the 30 minutes of fame. And so what was really neat about that is everything's in alignment because this listen, observe, and learn is now a 30 minutes of fame with an employee. It's a one-on-one that we're going to have with every one of our employees at least once, but up to 2 times a month to learn personally and professionally about how they're doing. And so we then came up with it, but now you got to roll out, well, how do you run this effective meeting? And how do you truly make sure that we're doing it right? And so we actually brought all our managers up to actually do role plays on how to run a 30 minutes of fame. So we got so much from the listen, observe, and learn from my section, it then became an initiative. The initiative was then trained and developed, and then you let your team of culture carriers do the rest. And that became a staple. Now, again, alignment is, listen, observe, and learn. 30 minutes of fame. One of the factors of engagement was a strong relationship. Well, meetings in 30 minutes of fame was to develop a strong relationship. It was to clearly communicate goals and expectations, and everything kind of made sense. So those are the things in a philosophy that we wanted to live. It couldn't just be me. We had 50 brick and mortar stores. I don't answer phones. I don't answer phones anymore. I need to ensure that we have the right folks who are able to do all of these initiatives and tasks.
Now, you have a quote from Marilyn Vos Savant that I always love this quote. It says, "To acquire knowledge, one must study, but to acquire wisdom, one must observe." And it sounds like you think that's a pretty valuable philosophy within culture.
I think it's a must-have. I'm not saying you don't already know. So whatever that thing is, you don't already know. But for me, what separated our team from others was our commitment to truly being present. Observe means in an interview, I wanted to listen to see how the interview process went with my area managers. Were they asking the right questions? Did they ask clarifying questions? What was their approach? Did they have the horn and halo effect where just because I'm a New England Patriots fan, I all of a sudden love the candidate? It would be on a sales call. How did they prepare? How did they deliver? How did they follow up? And so in everything we would do, I would get most of my information from training classes. We'd bring 30 people up. We would do some training. I'd have my session if I was either running it or, at lunch, talking to the team. What's going on out there? So these observable things really help me get a good understanding of what is truly going on versus what I thought was going on.
I think one of my pet peeves is when somebody's supposed to be engaged and they're looking at their phone constantly and looking around and checking emails. And I'm just thinking, so that person on the phone is more important than the conversation you're supposed to be having with me or whomever you're having the conversation with. You should be in the moment, right? So you were just talking about that. If you're observing, you should be observing and not checked out on 3 other things.
100%. And it's really hard to do that, as we know, because there's so many things that get thrown at us, and being committed to the task at hand. I mean, if I'm not doing it, they're not going to do it. And yeah, there are some rule of thumbs for meetings or things like that, which might be another question down the road. But to your point of it is not acceptable. It's not acceptable to be late. It's not acceptable to be staring at your phone. We want to be professional and courteous and inviting. And it's really important when it doesn't happen. How do you handle it? So
Yeah. I think I get in trouble with my family a lot because I'm the opposite of my 17-year-old son whose phone never leaves his hand. I'm constantly walking around without my phone, and my wife will say, well, didn't you get my text? No. It's in my office, and I didn't get the text. It's not glued to me. I guess it's the era that I grew up in. I'd rather just be in the moment. So,
one of the big things, Clint, I always recommend organizations do for that very point is generational perspective training, because Gen Z is motivated and driven and uses technology much different. I'm a Gen X, so much different than Gen X. But you have Gen Z, millennials, Xers, boomers, silent generation, all kind of pulled together. And I do think Gen Z gets a bad rap sometimes. I do think they're thought of as being lazy and distracted, and they bring a lot of technology to the game. And it's no different than I used to think when I was beginning to manage millennials. I used to, where time was a currency. And the millennials actually made us learn how to schedule with precision better, because career life integration was really important to them. And if we wanted to develop a diverse, whether it's ethnicity, thought, gender, generation, we needed to do all of these things. And so generational perspective training is really important, so you could understand these worldviews that each of us have. And that's where you're pulling from people and learning from people. So
right. Totally agree. Another one that came to mind for me is I do project management for my day job. And so there's a lot of teams, and there's a tendency to say, can't we just use the plan that was built by the other team and integrate it here? And you actually said you can't dictate your plan to the team. They need to feel their voice was heard. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, how do you accomplish that? I mean, I know the ways that I do it, but how do you accomplish where there's not some tendency to say, I know the plan here. I'm the expert in the room. Here it is. Just go execute it.
I think you have to come to a consensus that there are some critical things that are non-negotiable. So there are some fundamental things that we're going to put together. And the beauty about what we're going to do is allow you to color outside the lines a little bit. We can't cross ethical standards, but we are allowed to have a little, of course, flexibility with some of the delivery mechanisms. But we have to agree that these three things are a must. And unless someone's going to voice a really strong reason why, that today is your time to voice it, I want to hear what you think. But once, it's kind of the Ron Popeil inventor said it and forget it. Once we've committed, it's locked. The standard is set. This is where we're going. Here is our chance. And so, we would take a lot of things. We might have a weekly customer service vote that our team would get together and assess how the week went. And while I bet 85% of it was really similar between any branch, and then 15% was probably a little bit of extra fun that, however you decide to kind of make it your own, it's fine. But we agree talking about customer service should be able to drive behaviors. Yes. I mean, not many people will disagree with it. And so you do have to have that fine dance and balance and know when to be flexible, and also know when to say the standard is here. And while I love your feedback and I'd love to encompass hundreds of our employees together, if we do that, unfortunately, we won't make any progression, and we'll be staying and maybe even going backwards. So,
Good answer. And by the way, extra bonus points if you had a Ronco mention on your scorecard for today's call.
Yeah.
So what is a roadmap summit, and what are the objectives of it?
So for me, it was the brick and mortar of what we were going to be doing over the next period of time. So it was really important that you are clear on values and the behaviors that go under each value. And that's, honesty and integrity is probably every company's value. What does that mean in the existence of how we conduct business, whether it's dealing with vendors, clients, customers? So values, we have to agree that we are not going to shortchange. We are going to live these, not just list them. And so having behaviors under each was really important. Then a philosophy of how are we going to every day attack the day with the same philosophy, hence those factors of engagement we've already mentioned. And then we're going to bring these commitments, these things that are must-haves, where the sand goes through the hourglass, those 3 to 5 big rock items, those big initiatives, that we need to commit whole hands that here's where we're going to go. And then where do we see ourselves, not only short term, but long term. So some of those goals that are there. And for us, that was the blueprint that then got, as we will have a similar feel, would get backlogged into every training aspect of what we do. Everywhere you looked, it was hard to not know what was going on because we were living the same thing. We would have a morning huddle with our team. It's talking about the same 3 to 5 things. You get reviewed on the same 3 to 5 things. Your interview for the next level will have the same 3 to 5 things that you have to articulate of how you lived it. And so it really does become difficult to not know what's going on.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned something that's the opposite of what I see a lot of leaders do. Is I opened this podcast with the George Bernard Shaw quote that says the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Yeah. And I think most of us as leaders, we think we speak clearly. We think in it because in our mind it's very succinct. We know exactly what we want. Yet we communicate that, and we're often surprised by the fact that what I get back is not what I was expecting. And so what you're doing, you're just having these meetings over and over. So you're getting this clarifying questions answered. Repetition is telling them exactly how they should act.
Yeah, there was an interesting stat, and I'll probably butcher it, from meetings. And it was, within a few days of a meeting, 90% of the stuff is already forgotten. And of the stuff that's remembered, half is wrong. And so that's why you can't just say it once. You got to keep talking about it. I give a companies an exercise to do. And I say, do me a favor, look at your last 5 emails. I know this is so simple. Go look at your last 5. Did it make sense? Were you clear? Did it have the right tone, the right deadline, the right flex? Were you clear when you communicated your goals and expectations of that? And what you'll be alarmed, myself of course included, is you're like, oh my God, I could totally read that differently. It sounds differently the way I just read it again. I can't believe I used that word. That could be confusing. I just read. Not that long ago, I was dealing with a client, and they were sharing their time off plan. Now, going forward, you have to submit. And I tried to read the email. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't even understand it. And I'm smart enough that I should be able to understand a time off plan email. And it was just so convoluted. It was long. I talk a lot about becoming the distraction catcher and simplification or buffering things. And I'm just like, I'm not going to submit a time off. I don't even understand it. I'll take the pass. It's just too muddy.
Yeah, I often joke about the telephone game we played as kids where, if you don't know the game, basically it's the 5 or 6 kids in a room. One kid has a secret, whispers to the next kid who passes it on down the line. And of course, the fun in the game is that the message that comes out of the last person's mouth is not remotely close to what the first person said. And then the problem is that happens today in the business world. The exact same thing happens where I believe I give a clear message, yet it gets mangled. And the reason is, just as you alluded to, people take that message through their own biases, their own filters, the way they define terms, and frankly, whether they're having a bad day or not will also impact how I hear your message. And so it's important to have those clarifying conversations to make sure that the message does get received in the way in which you intended.
Absolutely.
Now, you talk about attitude, effort, and coachability, and you say everything is about those 3 things. What do you mean by that?
There was I think it was a wrestling coach, and I got to give a shout out to, it was an employee I learned this from early on in my career, and he was sharing about a wrestling coach and said in order to be great, you just need 3 things. And it was the right attitude, bring the same effort every day, and you just got to be able to get coached and be better. And if you can do those things. And so when we would hire, those were the kind of those were the things that we would look for. And it's free. I mean, it requires nothing else but a delivery every day that I'm going to bring the right message. And so when I hear attitude, effort, and coachability, it's what I tell my kids. It's what I tell my clients. It's what I've told everybody. because you will get so far by just doing the ordinary extraordinary. And I felt that those are just some ordinary things that if you do them extraordinarily well, you're just going to stand out, especially in the business climate we're in today. My kids, they grind, and not everyone's grinding. They're going to be able to separate themselves, and it's okay to work hard. It's not a bad word. So attitude, effort, and coachability became a staple that if I were ever to get a tattoo of words, those would be the ones I'm getting.
Got it. I think that for me, that's my superpower is you may be a lot smarter than me, but you are not going to outwork me. You're not. I'm going to work harder than you ever could. And I got a long way in life by just working hard. And I like to say I put myself in a position to get lucky because people looking from the outside go, oh, you got lucky. Yeah, okay. But I put myself in that position to get lucky by working super hard.
Absolutely. Listen, if you remember in the beginning, my opener was I was the smallest kid in my high school class. I've done push-ups and sit-ups for 40 years. Consistency beats intensity all day long. And so it's the death by 1,000 paper cuts. That's attitude and effort. And the coachability part comes in. We're trying to get better and better. Taking push-ups and sit-ups and now do a run. Okay, take push-ups, sit-ups, and a run. Now do some curls, do some pull-ups, do some whatever it is. You just got to be committed to do it. Everyone can do it. I use the analogy of getting in shape. Clint, no surprise, eat right, sleep right, and work out. Yet, who does that? Not enough.
Not enough.
Everyone knows. They know the what, not the how sometimes.
Well, that concludes part one of my conversation with Eric Stone, former Regional Vice President of Enterprise Mobility, founder and CEO of ClearPath Ventures, and author of Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture. Coming up in part two, Eric discusses the 4 Ds of time management: do, delegate, defer, and delete.
We thought it would be really helpful for our folks to learn that you can't do everything if you want to continue to be successful with it. And so you have to have the ability to potentially defer, so put it off. I take an email, or what do they call it? Delay delivery it for another week. I don't need it. I might be able to delegate it. So I might be able to take this task, give it to my team, and submit it clearly, communicate my goals and expectations, and fire that out. I might have to actually do it myself. So there were these things that we wanted to educate our team that when they made decisions, we wanted them to be mindful of those 4 Ds, and we felt everyone was taking too much of their own, so they were trying to do it all, and you just can't. And so we tried to teach some lessons of those 4 Ds.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.